My parents always said, that's just how things are. But one conversation made me question everything I thought was normal. I was 30 years old the first time someone asked me what I actually enjoyed doing, not what I was good at, not what I was working toward, not what my plans were, just what I enjoyed, purely, and without justification. I opened my mouth to answer, and nothing came out. I sat there, in the ordinary light of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and I could not answer a question that a well-adjusted 10-year-old should have been able to answer in seconds. And somewhere in that silence, in a strange blankness where an answer should have been, the first crack appeared in everything I had ever been told was simply the way things were. My name is Daniel. I'm 33 years old. I'm a financial analyst from a mid-sized city in Pennsylvania, and I grew up in a household where the phrase, "that's just how things are," was deployed the way other families deploy prayer, constantly, automatically, as both explanation and conclusion, as a way of closing doors that I hadn't yet realized I was allowed to open. It was said about money and ambition and emotion and relationships and rest and fun and every category of human experience that might, if examined too closely, require my parents to question the architecture of their own lives. That's just how things are. End of inquiry. Next topic. Move along. I believed them. For 30 years, I believed them completely, the way you believe in gravity, not because you've tested it, but because it has always been operative and because nobody around you seems to be floating. And then one conversation, one single, ordinary, Tuesday afternoon conversation with a person I had known for 4 months, reached into the foundation of everything I had accepted as given and pulled gently, and the whole structure shifted. This is the story of what I found underneath it. The world I grew up thinking was normal. My parents were not cruel people. This is the first thing I say, and I say it first because it is true, and because the story I am about to tell has a shape that sometimes gets mistaken for a story about cruelty, and that is not what it is. My father, Robert, worked 31 years for the same manufacturing company, in the same mid-level management role he had been promoted into at 29 and had never left, and he was proud of this the way people are proud of things they decided early and never revisited. My mother, Carol, had wanted to be a nurse, had started the prerequisites, had met my father and gotten pregnant with my older brother within a year, and had stepped away from school and never returned, and she was also proud of this, or had made herself proud of it, which I understand now is a different thing but which I could not have told you apart from the original, when I was young. We were comfortable. Not wealthy, comfortable. The specific American middle-class comfort of a house that needed things fixed but got them fixed, of vacations that were driving distance, of college savings accounts that covered a state school, of a life that was stable and predictable and, to a child who had never seen anything else, seemed to be simply what life was. What I absorbed from this life, over 18 years of living inside it, was a very specific curriculum. The curriculum went like this. Work is not supposed to be enjoyable, it is supposed to be stable. Ambition beyond a certain modest ceiling is suspicious, a sign of ingratitude or delusion or both. Emotions are private and largely inconvenient. Men do not discuss feelings in any terms beyond the most functional, not because feelings aren't there but because examining them too closely is self-indulgent and leads nowhere useful. Fun is for weekends and retirement. Rest must be earned. Desire, real desire, the deep wanting of a life organized around what you actually love, is a luxury that other people have, people with different circumstances, and it is vaguely embarrassing to want it for yourself. These were not stated. They were atmospheric. They were in the way my father changed the channel when something on television required emotional engagement. They were in the way my mother responded to my brother's dream of becoming a graphic designer with a patient smile and a suggestion that he also get a business degree. They were in the words "that's just how things are," which I heard so often and in so many contexts that by the time I was a teenager I had internalized the phrase as a kind of cognitive reflex, the automatic response to any question that pushed against the edges of what our life contained. I want to give you examples because the examples are important. They are important because they were so ordinary. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would have registered from the outside as a household with something wrong in it. Just the slow, steady, daily curriculum of a life lived inside a very small idea of what was possible. When I was 12, I told my father I wanted to be an architect. I had just seen a building in a magazine that had made something move in my chest, a real physical sensation, the way beautiful things sometimes land in the body before the brain has processed them. My father listened and said, "Architects spend a lot of years in school for not a lot of money. Engineering is where the work is." And then he said it. That's just how things are. I did not become an architect. I did not pursue engineering either. Ultimately, I became a financial analyst, which was stable and paid reasonably, and had nothing to do with any sensation I had ever felt in my body looking at anything. When I was 16 and my grandfather died, my mother's father, a man I loved and who had told me stories and smelled like pipe tobacco and taught me to fish, I cried in my room alone. At dinner, my father talked about logistics, the arrangements, who was driving where. My mother ate quietly. Nobody asked how I was doing. After dinner, I helped with dishes, and my father said, "You're handling this well," which I understood to mean, "You are being appropriately contained." I was not handling it well. I was 16, and I had lost someone I loved, and I was handling it in a way that left no evidence, which I had learned was the goal. When I was 22, recently graduated, offered a position in another city, a city I had always wanted to live in, with a company that felt genuinely exciting to my 22-year-old self, my mother said, "Why would you go somewhere you don't have any roots?" My father said, "Stability is worth more than excitement at your age." I took a job 30 minutes from home. I told myself this was the right decision. I believed it mostly in the way you believe things that everyone around you agrees are true. That's just how things are. And things were that way, as far as I could see, for everyone around me. My aunts and uncles had versions of the same life. My parents' friends had versions of the same life. The neighborhood had versions of the same life. The template was everywhere, and its ubiquity made it feel less like a choice and more like a fact of nature. The way poverty or weather is a fact of nature, something you adapt to rather than question. 30 years of not questioning. I want to tell you what the unquestioned life looked like, because I think this is the part that is hardest to convey to someone who hasn't lived it. It did not look miserable. It did not look like deprivation or suffering. It looked, from the inside, more or less fine. And that is the specific difficulty of a life lived inside inherited assumptions. It doesn't hurt in any way that is easy to name. It just has a persistent, low-level quality of incompleteness that you've been taught to interpret not as a symptom of something wrong, but as evidence of appropriate adult humility. I went to work. I was good at the work. I was, in fact, very good at it, analytical and precise, and capable of the particular kind of extended concentration that financial modeling requires. I was promoted twice by 28. I made more money than my father had made at my age, which he acknowledged with a nod that I understood was pride, and which landed in me the way achievement had always landed, briefly, satisfyingly, and then it was gone, like warmth from a match. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment that was neat and furnished and entirely without personality. I did not think of this as a reflection of anything. It was just an apartment. When a colleague visited once and said, "You should put some things up," gesturing at the walls, I looked at the walls and realized I had been living there for 2 years and had not once thought about what I might want on them. The blankness had not registered as absence. It had just been the walls. I dated. I was in 2 relationships of meaningful length, one for 3 years, one for 2, both of which ended in the specific way that relationships end when 2 people are essentially compatible on paper and essentially not reaching each other in any way that matters. Both women afterward said versions of the same thing, that they had always felt like they were the only one trying to go deep, that I was present without being accessible, that there was something behind the surface they could never quite get to. I received this feedback each time with genuine puzzlement. I did not know what was behind the surface. I was not aware, at the time, that there was a surface. I did not have hobbies. I had activities, a gym membership I used consistently, a standing poker game with colleagues, weekends at my parents' house most Sundays, sports on television. None of these were things I had chosen from the inside. They were things that men did, that people did, that the template accommodated. When I tried to think about what I actually enjoyed, what made time move differently, what I would do if no one were watching and nothing were at stake, I came up empty. Not painfully empty, just blank. The question felt slightly foreign, like it was in a language I had never been taught to speak. That's just how things are had been so thorough, so pervasive, so complete in its saturation of everything I had ever been told about life, that I had simply stopped generating the questions it was designed to shut down. The reflex had preempted the inquiry. I had become someone who did not wonder about alternatives because I had been trained, early and well, to understand that wondering was beside the point. I was 30 years old, and I was, by every measure I had been given to measure myself, doing fine. I had no idea that fine and good were different things. I had no idea. I was only acquainted with one of them. The conversation. Her name was Priya. She was a consultant who had been brought in by my firm for a 6-week engagement, and we had been placed on the same project, and she was the kind of person who asked questions with genuine interest rather than social obligation. She was not extraordinary in any theatrical sense. She was simply, and I mean this as the profound compliment it is, a person who is fully present in conversations. When she talked to you, she looked at you as though you were interesting. It sounds small. It was not small. We had lunch on a Tuesday in late October, early in the engagement, at a restaurant near the office. It was the third time we had spoken beyond professional context. We had covered work, then the usual biographical data. Where are you from? How long have you been here? The coordinates that people exchange to establish basic human orientation. And then she said, casually between bites of something, "What do you actually enjoy? Like, not career stuff. Just what you actually like doing." I opened my mouth to answer, and nothing came out. I want to be precise about what happened in that moment, because it was not what it might look like from the outside. It was not that I froze with emotion, or that some buried thing suddenly surfaced dramatically. It was quieter and stranger than that. It was that I genuinely searched for an answer and found that the filing system in which such an answer should have been stored was empty. Or not empty exactly, but filled with things that didn't belong there. Things like I enjoy being productive and I like doing things well, and I don't mind the poker game with the guys. Answers that were about performance or habit or social accommodation rather than about any actual experience of joy or preference or desire. I said finally, "I'm not sure I know." Priya looked at me. Not with pity, not with alarm, with genuine curiosity, the way you'd look at something that surprised you pleasantly. She said, "Really? That's interesting. Why do you think that is?" And something about the way she asked it, not that's so sad or you should figure that out, but just why do you think that is? With the simple open curiosity of someone who found the answer genuinely interesting, made me want to try to answer honestly. I said, "I think I was raised to think that kind of question was a bit beside the point." She said, "How do you mean?" And I heard myself say, for the first time out loud, the phrase that had organized my entire life. That's just how things are. I explained it, the way my parents had used it, the things it had been applied to, the way it had functioned as a ceiling on inquiry. And Priya listened to all of it, and then she said something that was so simple it should not have changed anything and changed everything. She said, "But how did they know?" I looked at her. She said, "How do they know that's just how things are? Like, who decided?" Because I think a lot of what people say is fixed is actually just what they personally encountered and decided to stop questioning. And if someone told them it was fixed, maybe someone told that person too. At some point someone just accepted it, and it became how things are. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I said, "I've never thought about it that way." She said, "It's worth thinking about." That was the whole conversation. No revelations. No dramatic uncovering. A lunch, a question, a simple reframe. And I drove back to the office afterward and sat at my desk and found I could not concentrate on anything at all because a very small and very insistent voice had started asking, for the first time in 30 years, a question I had been trained never to ask. How do they know? The crack and what came through it. The question, once it existed, could not be unasked. That is the thing about the right question. It changes the landscape. Not just in the place it's pointing, but everywhere you turn. I would be in the middle of ordinary things, reviewing a spreadsheet, driving home, making dinner, and the question would be there, attaching itself to the structures of my life with the quiet tenacity of something that has been waiting a long time to be acknowledged. That's just how things are. But how do they know? I thought about the architecture job I hadn't pursued. Not with nostalgia exactly. I was 30, not 12, and the path to architecture was not one I was about to start over and walk from the beginning. But I thought about the decision, about how quickly it had been closed, about the fact that the closing had come not from any real examination of whether I wanted it, but from a single sentence about where the jobs were, a sentence delivered by a man who had never worked in any field adjacent to architecture, who had never looked at what architects actually made or what the actual job market was, who had simply reached for the reflexive answer and handed it to me as a fact. That's just how things are. But he hadn't known. He had assumed, and I had accepted the assumption as fact for 18 years. I started doing something I had never done before. I started asking why about things I had always taken as given. Not combatively, not even out loud, mostly. Just internally, as a practice. The way you might start noticing the furniture in a room you've lived in for years and suddenly see it as furniture rather than as the neutral background of your life. Why had I taken the job 30 minutes from home rather than the one in the city that excited me? Because stability. But why was that city less stable? It wasn't, particularly. The company there had been, if anything, in a stronger position. The stability argument hadn't actually held up on its own terms. It had been a proxy for something else, which was my parents' discomfort with distance, which was a real thing but was not the same thing, as that's just how things are. Why did I live in an apartment with no art on the walls? Because I had never put any up. Why had I never put any up? I genuinely didn't know. There was no reason. There was just absence. The absence of the question, which was itself produced by a lifetime of being taught that attending to your own aesthetic preferences was not a serious activity, was decoration in the diminutive sense, was a thing other people did with money and time they had in surplus. Why had both of my significant relationships ended with someone telling me they couldn't reach me? What was behind the surface? I started, for the first time, to find out. The identity underneath the assumptions. Therapy was not a thing my family did. That's just how things are. Had views on therapy that were predictable and unexamined. It was for people with serious problems, real problems, not for ordinary people working through the ordinary difficulty of being alive. My father, if asked, would have said this with complete confidence. He had never been to therapy. He had learned from his father that internal difficulty was managed through discipline and silence and forward motion. My mother had internalized a version of the same. I went anyway. I sat in a room with a therapist named Dr. Cantor, and I started, slowly, and with some difficulty, to say out loud the things I had been thinking privately since that Tuesday lunch. He listened and asked questions and did not tell me I was handling things well when I was clearly not handling things. Over the months that followed, I started to find things. Not buried treasures, not suppressed dramatic revelations, just the quiet contents of a self that had not been attended to in a long time. Preferences, sensibilities, ways of being that were mine, that had been there the whole time, that I had been walking past without noticing. I found out that I was more interested in aesthetics than I had ever allowed myself to be, that I noticed buildings and spaces, and the way light moved in rooms. That this was not a frivolous thing, it was just a thing, a feature of how I processed the world, no more or less legitimate than any other. I started putting things on the walls. This sounds absurd as a landmark, and I am telling you anyway because it was one, the first time I bought something because I found it beautiful and put it somewhere I would see it every day. I stood back and looked at it and felt something shift. The apartment started to look like somewhere a person lived. I found out that I was angrier than I had known. Not surface anger, not at anything specific, not in any way that expressed itself as temper or aggression, but a deeper, older frustration with the smallness of the template I had been handed and the ease with which I had accepted it. This anger, once I found it, was important. Not because I wanted to live inside it or direct it at my parents, I didn't, but because anger is information. Anger about a situation tells you that the situation is wrong. My anger told me the template was wrong. And knowing it was wrong was the first step toward building something better. I found out that I was curious. Deeply, almost embarrassingly curious, about things I had never given myself permission to be curious about. Philosophy, architecture, not as a career path, but as a thing to learn and think about and take seriously as a way of understanding the world. The history of cities, The way economies worked at a level I had never examined even professionally, because my professional engagement with it had always been functional rather than passionate. I started reading in a way I hadn't since I was a child reading, because something interested me. The pleasure of it was so unfamiliar, it was almost alarming. These are small things. I know they're small things. A man in his early 30s discovers he likes aesthetics and has unexamined anger and is curious about ideas. This is not a dramatic awakening. But it was the discovery of a self that had been there the whole time, underneath the performance of fine, and finding it felt enormous in the way quiet things sometimes feel enormous when you have been without them long enough. The conversation with my parents. I want to tell you about this carefully because it was not a confrontation, and I think it is important that you understand it was not a confrontation. I was not interested in assigning blame or relitigating my childhood or making my parents feel they had failed. I had enough therapy by then to understand the inheritance, to understand that my father's template had come from his father's template, that that's just how things are had probably been said to him in some form long before he ever said it to me, that the limitation was not personal malice, but the profound, ordinary human tendency to confuse what you encountered with what is inevitable. What I wanted was honesty. And I wanted it because I had realized in the course of all this uncovering that I was angry in a specific direction, not at my parents, but at the pretense. At the way that's just how things are had been delivered with certainty when it had been actually an expression of fear or habit or limited experience. At the way I had been given assumptions as facts and had only now, at 30, begun to sort out which was which. I went home for a weekend visit. This was not unusual. On Saturday afternoon, when my mother was in the kitchen and my father was on the back porch reading, I went and sat with him and said, "Can I ask you something?" He put the paper down. He said, "Go ahead." I said, "Did you ever want to do something different? Something other than what you did?" He looked at me for a moment. I could see him deciding whether to give me the reflexive answer or the real one. Then he said, slowly, "I thought about law school when I was young." This was the first time I had ever heard this. 33 years, and I had never heard this. I said, "What happened?" He said, "Your grandfather didn't see the point. Said there were enough lawyers. Said getting a steady job was the smart move." A pause. He wasn't wrong. I said, very carefully, "Did you ever wonder if he was?" My father looked at the yard. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I figured there wasn't much point wondering." And there it was. The origin point. My grandfather had handed my father a ceiling and a phrase to justify it, and my father had accepted both, and had handed them to me with the same certainty, and had never once, in the time between receiving them and passing them on, wondered whether they were actually true. Not because he was incurious or dishonest, but because he had been taught, as I had been taught, that wondering was beside the point. I said, "I think there might have been a point." He looked at me. I could not fully read the expression. It was somewhere between discomfort and something older, something that might have been recognition or grief, or just the particular heaviness of a man looking at the cost of a thing he had accepted too early and too completely. He said, "You turning out all right?" I said, "I'm figuring it out." He nodded. He picked up the paper. Then he put it back down and said, without looking at me, "You don't have to do it the way I did." 8 words. The most important thing he had ever said to me. And I understood, hearing them, that they cost him something, that saying them was, in some quiet way, an acknowledgement that there might have been other ways he could have done it too. I did not push on that. I just said, "Thanks, Dad," and sat with him for a while in the afternoon, and it was the most honest we had ever been in the same space. My mother was harder, in the way that mothers are sometimes harder because the attachment runs differently, because the accounting of daily life over 18 years was so much more granular, and therefore the gaps were more numerous and specific. We had a longer conversation, over dishes that evening, that wandered through many territories, the nursing she had given up, the choices she had made, the pride she had taken in my stability, and what that pride had required me to provide. She was defensive at moments and honest at other moments, and at one point she said, "We just wanted you to be secure," with a sincerity that was absolute, and which I received absolutely. I said, "I know, but I think I confused secure with small for a long time." She was quiet. Then she said, "What does that mean?" I said, I think I thought a smaller life was a safer one, because that's what I was shown. And I'm trying to figure out what I actually want, outside of what I was told was sensible. She said, and what do you want? I said, I don't fully know yet. That's the honest answer. But I'm learning to ask. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, that sounds lonely. I said, sometimes. It also sounds like mine. She dried a dish. She handed me another to dry. We finished the dishes in a silence that was not entirely comfortable and not entirely uncomfortable and was, for us, a new kind of honest. The slow shift. The identity shift that followed was not a metamorphosis. It was more like what happens when you're navigating by a map that turns out to be slightly wrong. You don't throw the map away, you adjust your understanding of where you are, you start noticing where the landmarks don't quite match, and you update your sense of the territory. You are the same person. But your relationship to the map has changed completely.